She was the queen of our cul-de-sac. Then she decided a creek was in her way. So she paid men to bury it in concrete. Neighbors warned her. Months passed. Water rose where no water should be, and her perfect villa went under first. My name is Marichin, and 3 years ago my husband Daniel and I bought our first home in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet development wrapped around a slow, clear stream that gave the neighborhood its name. Our daughter Lily was 2. We thought we'd found forever. The creek ran behind 6 backyards. Ours included feeding a small wetland before curving past the largest house in the neighborhood, a white-columned villa belonging to Deborah Whitfield, the HOA president, a woman everyone called sweet to her face and something else behind closed doors. Deborah had run the HOA board for 11 years, longer than anyone could remember an election actually being contested. She controlled the newsletter, the fines, the landscaping committee, and, seemed, the unspoken rules of who belonged and who didn't. Her villa sat highest on the hill, its manicured lawn rolling down toward the creek like something out of a magazine. She called it her legacy property and reminded people, often, that she'd been here before any of us. The first time I met her, she inspected my porch pots and told me marigolds were not the aesthetic of Willow Creek. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She was not joking. Daniel warned me early, don't cross Deborah Whitfield. She'd once fined a widower 2 doors down for leaving his trash bin out 4 hours past pickup. 3 weeks running, until he sold and moved away. Still, for the first year, we kept our heads down, paid our dues, mowed on schedule, and admired the creek that ran cool and glittering behind our fence line every summer evening. What none of us knew was that Deborah had been quietly buying up creek-adjacent easement rights from the county for 2 years, filing paperwork under a landscaping LLC that traced back to her husband's name. Not hers. She wanted a private pond. Not a retention pond. Not a community feature. A mirror-still ornamental lake behind her villa. The kind she'd seen in a magazine spread about a senator's estate in Virginia. The creek, unfortunately, did not run behind her house. It ran past it, then curved away toward ours and 4 others before draining into county wetlands half a mile downstream. To get her lake, she needed to redirect the entire waterway, dam it, reroute it, and pour a new channel of poured concrete that would empty the water exactly where she wanted, and nowhere else. She never once mentioned this plan at a general meeting. She mentioned landscape enhancements and erosion control, phrases so boring that half the board stopped listening after the first sentence. In April, unmarked trucks began appearing at the end of our street at 6 in the morning, hauling gravel and pipe sections no one had voted on. I asked her directly at the mailbox what the trucks were for. She smiled the particular smile she used before lying and said, "Just some drainage improvements, dear. Nothing that concerns you." My neighbor Priya, whose yard also bordered the creek, mentioned that county inspectors had never come by, which struck her as strange for work this size. Daniel, ever the optimist, said maybe it really was drainage work. Maybe Deborah for once was doing something for the whole street instead of just herself. I wanted to believe that too. I really did. She avoided my eyes at the mailbox, told me this was never going to be about all of us. The first crack in the calm came on a Tuesday morning when Priya called me, her voice tight, saying her koi pond, fed by a natural spring connected to the creek, had gone bone dry overnight. We walked the fence line together and found freshly poured concrete forming a diversion channel exactly where the creek used to bend toward our properties. The water had been rerouted straight toward Deborah's hillside. Priya filed a complaint with the HOA office. Within 2 days she received a notice citing her for an unauthorized water feature, and a fine of $400 for the pond sheet had since before Deborah was even elected. I brought photos of the new concrete channel to the next board meeting, expecting outrage. Instead, Deborah stood, thanked me for my concern, and explained the county had approved everything. She simply hadn't gotten around to telling us yet. When I asked to see the approval documents, she said HOA records were not public during active projects, and moved swiftly to the next agenda item, a proposal to repaint mailboxes uniform white. That night, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table with a printed county parcel map. The diversion channel, if finished, would send far more water downhill than the wetlands could absorb, right past our home. I mentioned this to my father over the phone. He'd spent 30 years as a hydrologist before retiring, and even secondhand, over a bad connection. His voice sharpened immediately. "Tell me everything," he said. My father, turned out, had seen this exact mistake made twice in his career, private landowners rerouting natural drainage for aesthetics, only to overload the system somewhere downstream they never bothered to model. He told me the technical term for what Deborah was doing was flow concentration. Instead of the creek spreading its water gently across a floodplain, it would now blast, full force, through a narrow man-made channel. "Ask her who her engineer is," he said. "A real one would never sign off on this without a full watershed study." I promised I would, though I doubted she'd tell me anything real. At the next community potluck, I asked casually who was overseeing the drainage project. Deborah answered without missing a beat. Her nephew, Corey, who had years of landscape design experience. Landscape design, not hydrology. And said nothing, though Priya, standing beside me, arched an eyebrow that said she'd noticed too. A week later, 3 more households near the wetland reported standing water pooling in their yards after ordinary rain. Water that had never pooled there before in a decade of living on the street. One neighbor, Frank, an elderly veteran who'd lived in Willow Creek since it was built, said his crawl space had flooded for the first time ever, ruining boxes of photographs he could never replace. Frank brought his complaint to Deborah in person. She told him, in front of witnesses, that older homes settle and that his flooding had nothing to do with the landscaping. I started keeping a folder. Photos, dates, Frank's ruined photographs, Priya's dry koi pond, the fine notices, everything. Not because I had a plan yet, but because something told me we'd need proof eventually. Deborah, for her part, seemed untouchable. She hosted her spring garden tour that weekend, walking a dozen admiring neighbors past the construction site, calling it the future crown jewel of Willow Creek. By May, the diversion project had grown bolder. Heavy machinery cleared a swath of mature trees along the creek's natural bend. Trees that had anchored the soil there for probably 60 years. Daniel and I watched from our back porch as an excavator tore a new channel straight through what used to be a shaded, root-woven bank, replacing it with raw dirt and exposed clay. I called the county planning office myself, giving them the address and asking whether a permit existed for creek modification on Deborah's property. The clerk put me on hold for 11 minutes. When she came back, she said there was a permit on file, but it was dated 8 months prior, for a project described only as minor landscaping berm, nothing resembling what we were watching. That was the first real crack in Deborah's story. A minor berm does not require an excavator, 3 dump trucks, and a crew working 6 days a week for a month straight. I brought this discrepancy to the HOA board in writing, copying every member, asking formally for a special session to review the drainage project before more damage occurred downstream. Deborah responded within an hour, not to me, but with a mass email to the entire neighborhood accusing certain residents of spreading misinformation to sabotage a beautification project meant to raise everyone's property values. Several neighbors who'd never even seen the construction site sided with her instantly, commenting on the community app about how lucky we were to have someone so dedicated to Willow Creek's appearance. Priya wasn't surprised. She's been buying Goodwill for years, she told me over coffee. Free landscaping tips, holiday baskets, glowing newsletter shout-outs. People forget what she did to the Hendersons. I hadn't heard about the Hendersons. Priya explained. A young couple who'd questioned Deborah's parking rules 2 years back, fined into near bankruptcy over technicalities, and finally forced to sell at a loss. That story settled into my stomach like a stone. This wasn't impulsiveness. This was a pattern. A method Deborah had refined over years of quietly grinding down anyone who challenged her. Still, I kept documenting. I photographed the exposed creek bed, the dying willow roots left in open air, the new concrete lip forming along Deborah's property line, angled to funnel water downhill fast. Frank's flooded crawlspace happened again after a routine afternoon shower, this time with visibly more water than before. He showed me the water line, 4 inches up his foundation wall. I suggested he file an official incident report with the county, separate from the HOA. He hesitated. He didn't want trouble. He said, "Not at 81. Not after everything with the Hendersons." That hesitation, that fear in a decorated veteran's voice, told me everything about how deep Deborah's control over this neighborhood really ran, and how few people felt safe standing against her. I told him I'd help him file it myself, that he wouldn't have to face her alone. He looked at me for a long moment before nodding, quiet gratitude in his tired eyes. Together we submitted a formal drainage complaint to the county the following morning, attaching photos, dates, and a short written account of the flooding pattern since construction began. 2 days later, Deborah cornered me at the community mailboxes, her voice low and pleasant in the way that somehow made it more threatening than shouting would have been. "I heard you and Frank have been busy," she said, smiling. "I'd hate for something like this to affect your standing with the board. Renovations always come with resale value considerations. You know, it wasn't a subtle threat." She was telling me, in her sweetest tone, that she could make trouble for my home's HOA compliance record if I kept pushing. I said nothing and walked away. That night I told Daniel everything. He set down his fork and said quietly, "She's not going to stop unless someone makes her stop. And it sounds like that someone is you." I didn't want to be that someone. I wanted a quiet street, a safe yard for Lily, a normal life. But every day the water crept a little closer to normal became a little harder to find. A week of unusual silence followed. No trucks, no excavators, no mass emails. For a moment, I let myself believe the county complaint had actually worked, that Deborah had backed down. Then Priya texted a photo, Deborah's newsletter, glossy and cheerful, announcing the grand unveiling of her new Whitfield reflection pond, complete with an invitation to a garden party the following Saturday. The silence hadn't been retreat. It had been the finishing touches. Somehow, despite my complaint, despite Frank's flooding, the project had simply continued behind a curtain of quiet. I called the county back, furious, and was told my complaint was under review, a phrase that apparently could stretch indefinitely with no deadline attached to it whatsoever. At the garden party, Deborah stood beside her new pond in a wide sun hat, champagne in hand, thanking her wonderful nephew Corey for engineering a true masterpiece for the whole community to enjoy. The pond was beautiful, I'll admit that, still and glassy, reflecting her white columns perfectly. Nearly 30 neighbors clapped. Only Priya, Frank, and I stood near the back, not clapping. I noticed something the others didn't. The new concrete spillway at the pond's edge, angled not toward any retention basin, but directly downhill toward the 6 backyards below, including mine. I asked Corey, standing near the drink table, what the spillway's capacity rating was for storm overflow. He blinked, clearly unprepared for the question, and said he'd have to check with the county on that. A licensed engineer wouldn't need to check. A licensed engineer would already know, because it's the first calculation you make before pouring a single yard of concrete near a natural waterway. I smiled, thanked him, and walked away, my folder of evidence growing heavier in my mind with every polite lie I collected from Deborah's family and friends that afternoon. That evening, checking the county's public contractor license database from my laptop, I searched Corey's full name. Nothing came up. No engineering license. No permits filed under his name. Ever. I sat with that discovery for a long time. Deborah had let an unlicensed relative reroute a natural waterway above 6 occupied homes, and had called it a true masterpiece in front of 30 applauding neighbors. I decided not to confront her directly again. Confrontation only sharpened her, made her quicker and crueler. Instead, I began building something quieter, a timeline, dated and documented, that could stand on its own. Frank agreed to keep a flood log, noting every instance of water in his crawl space with dates, photos, and depth measurements, a habit from his military days that made him meticulous without complaint. Priya reached out to 2 more households along the wetland's edge, both of whom had noticed soil erosion and new cracks along their fence lines since the pond's completion. One of them, a quiet retired schoolteacher named Rosalind, mentioned something I hadn't known. She'd lived in a different HOA community, 2 counties over, where Deborah had briefly served on a landscaping committee a decade earlier. Rosalind remembered a very similar dispute there, a rerouted drainage ditch, a flooded cul-de-sac, and a woman named Deborah who left abruptly under a cloud of unpaid contractor invoices before anyone could hold her accountable. That was the first thread of a pattern stretching back further than Willow Creek, further than any of us had imagined, and it made the folder in my desk drawer feel suddenly much more important. I began requesting old HOA board minutes through the neighborhood archive request process, curious whether Deborah's fingerprints appeared on similar improvement projects in the years before we'd moved in. For nearly 3 weeks, life almost returned to normal. The weather stayed dry. Genic. Deborah posted glowing updates about koi she'd added and a new gazebo she planned for autumn. Frank's crawlspace stayed dry too, and for a moment even he allowed himself to relax, telling me over the fence that maybe he'd overreacted. Maybe the worst really was behind us. I didn't believe it. Not fully. But I let Lily play in the yard without checking the creek line every hour. Let myself enjoy an ordinary Saturday barbecue with Daniel for the first time in weeks. Deborah, emboldened by the calm, proposed a new HOA rule requiring all residents to submit landscaping plans for board approval before any yard changes, citing her own successful pond project as the new community standard. The rule passed 6-1. The lone dissenting vote belonging to a board member named Walter, a soft-spoken retired accountant who rarely spoke up but had quietly attended every single meeting for 9 years. I didn't know Walter well then, only that he sat at the end of the table taking careful notes on a yellow legal pad no one else seemed to pay attention to. During the lull, I used the archive records to trace 3 prior improvement projects Deborah had pushed through the board over the years, each one funded partially through HOA reserve funds without full itemized disclosure. None of the projects, on paper, looked criminal, but together they painted a picture of someone who treated community funds and community land as extensions of her own private estate, one renovation at a time. I mentioned this pattern to Daniel one night, and he pointed out something I hadn't considered. If Deborah had misused HOA reserves before, there might be a paper trail with the property management company. Not just the board. The property management company, turned out, was required by state law to retain financial records for 7 years. And homeowners had a legal right to request an audit with enough signatures. Quietly, over the next several days, I began approaching neighbors I trusted, not with accusations, just with questions, gauging who might sign a request for a financial audit without word getting back to Deborah. Frank signed first, without hesitation. Priya signed next, saying she'd wanted to for years but never had anyone brave enough to start it. Slowly, the list grew to 9 names. 9 wasn't enough. 80% of homeowners, which in our case meant 22 signatures, a number that felt impossibly far away given how many people still trusted Deborah completely. I didn't push further that week. I let the folder rest, let the signatures rest, and focused on Lily's upcoming birthday party, trying to remember what life felt like before I knew any of this. But the calm, as calm always seemed to with Deborah Whitfield, was only ever the quiet stretch of water before the next drop of the falls. The rain started on a Thursday in late June. Nothing unusual at first. Just a normal summer storm system moving through over 2 days, the kind Willow Creek had weathered 100 times before. By Friday evening, the new concrete channel behind Deborah's pond was running loud and fast, a sound none of us had ever associated with our formerly gentle, murmuring creek. Frank called me at 9 that night, his voice tight. Water was rising in his crawlspace again, faster than before, already past the old waterline he'd marked in permanent marker weeks earlier. I walked the fence line in the rain with a flashlight and found the new spillway overflowing, sending a steady sheet of water directly toward the 6 backyards below. Exactly the pattern Corey had failed to calculate. By midnight, 3 more households reported standing water in their yards, 2 with water creeping toward garage doors. all of it traceable back to the same overflowing concrete channel above Deborah's pond. I called Deborah directly, something I'd avoided for weeks. She answered sounding irritated, said the storm was an act of God, and that everyone's yard floods sometimes. Before hanging up before I could respond, the rain stopped by Saturday morning, and the immediate flooding receded within hours. But the damage was done. Frank's crawlspace ruined again, 2 garages soaked, and Rosalind's fence finally buckling along its waterlogged base. I photographed everything again, cross-referencing it with Frank's flood log and the earlier incidents, building a timeline now spanning 3 separate flooding events, each one worse than the last. At the emergency board meeting Deborah called that Sunday, she opened by thanking everyone for their patience during this unprecedented weather event, framing herself as a leader guiding the community through hardship. I raised my hand and asked, calmly, whether the board had considered that the flooding correlated directly with the new drainage channel's completion, not with the weather itself. Deborah's smile tightened. Disappointing that some residents wanted to politicize a natural disaster instead of supporting the community, and moved quickly to close the meeting. Walter, the quiet accountant, spoke up for the first time in months, asking simply whether the county permit for the pond project could be shared with the full board, as bylaws technically required for projects over a certain cost. Deborah said she'd look into it, and adjourned the meeting less than a minute later, visibly rattled in a way I hadn't seen from her before. Afterward, Walter approached me in the parking lot, glancing around before speaking quietly. "I've been keeping my own notes," he said. "I think it's time we compared them." Walter's notes, turned out, were extraordinarily thorough, 9 years of meeting minutes, budget line items, and vendor invoices, cross-referenced by hand in a system only a retired accountant would have the patience to build. He showed me a line item from 2 years earlier, $48,000 paid to a company called Whitfield Grading and Design LLC for community landscaping services. A company I quickly confirmed was registered to Deborah's husband. The HOA had, in effect, paid Deborah's own family business nearly $50,000 of resident dues for a project that was never put out to competitive bid, never disclosed to the general membership, and never fully explained. Walter had suspected something for years but lacked the confidence, and frankly the allies, to raise it alone. "People don't like hearing their neighborhood isn't as nice as it looks," he said. Together, we combined our folders, my photographs and flood logs, his financial records, and for the first time, the picture stopped looking like a landscaping dispute and started looking like something closer to fraud. I brought the combined findings to Priya and Frank that weekend, laying it all out on my kitchen table. Frank went quiet for a long moment before saying, "She's been robbing us blind and calling it beautification." We agreed the 22 signature threshold for a financial audit was now more urgent than ever, and Walter, with his standing on the board, believed he could help us reach it faster than we expected. Over the following week, Walter approached homeowners individually, framing the audit not as an attack on Deborah but as a routine transparency measure any responsible board should welcome, a framing that put people at ease. Slowly, the signatures climbed, 14, then 18, then 20. Rosalind's sister-in-law, who lived 2 streets over and had never met Deborah personally, signed simply because the math in Walter's summary alarmed her. On the day we reached 22 signatures, I felt something close to relief for the first time in months. Though a colder, more cautious part of me knew Deborah wouldn't go down without a fight. We submitted the audit request formally to the property management company, per bylaws, triggering a 30-day window in which an independent financial review would have to begin, whether Deborah welcomed it or not. Deborah found out within 2 days, faster than any of us expected, and her response was immediate and vicious in a way that confirmed we'd finally struck something real. She called an emergency meeting and, without naming names, delivered a 20-minute speech about toxic negativity and a small group of malcontents trying to tear down everything this community has built together. Then the fines arrived for an unkempt flower bed he hadn't touched in weeks. Priya was cited for a garden gnome supposedly violating decor guidelines that had never been enforced before. I received 3 citations in a single week, for a garbage can left out an hour early, for a car parked 6 inches over an invisible line, and for grass Deborah's inspection notice called unreasonably long. Walter, protected somewhat by his board position, was instead quietly removed from the landscaping and finance subcommittees he'd served on for years, stripped of access to the very records that had exposed her. None of it was subtle. Dressed up in the language of policy, and everyone on the street understood exactly what message it was meant to send to anyone else considering signing an audit request. Some neighbors, frightened, asked Walter if they could withdraw their signatures. He told them gently that once submitted, the request stood. The 30-day clock was already running, whether they liked it or not. Deborah's tone shifted from icy elegance to something sharper. At the mailbox one morning, she told me directly that people like me always thought they were smarter than the system, right up until the system corrected them. I didn't respond. Just aftermath instead. My newest, most absurd citation, taped to my own front door in an envelope stamped urgent in red ink. Daniel wanted to hire a lawyer immediately. I agreed, and we found one specializing in HOA disputes. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez who read our folder in under 20 minutes and let out a low whistle. "This isn't just a landscaping dispute," Patricia said. "Unpermitted creek modification, potential HOA fund misappropriation, and what looks like retaliatory fining against complainants. You have the beginnings of a very strong case." Patricia advised us to keep documenting everything but to let the audit process run its course first, warning that moving too aggressively before the financial review completed could give Deborah room to claim we were harassing her. So we waited, gathering evidence quietly while the independent auditor, a firm out of the county seat, began requesting records from the property management company under the 30-day mandate. Deborah, meanwhile, doubled down publicly, hosting a second garden event. This one billed as a community healing celebration, clearly designed to rally support and paint herself as a victim of internal sabotage. Nearly 40 neighbors attended, many of whom had no idea about the flooding, the fines, or the audit. Only that Deborah had thrown another lovely party with catered lemonade and a string quartet. I watched from my porch, not attending, as guests admired her pond glittering under string lights, none of them noticing the fresh hairline crack now visible along the concrete spillway's edge in the evening sun. That crack, small as it was, sent a chill through me. My father, when I described it over the phone, said hairline cracks in freshly poured spillway concrete under load were not a good sign at all. He explained that if the underlying soil hadn't been properly compacted before pouring, a corner quarry, unlicensed and inexperienced, likely would have cut. The whole structure could weaken significantly with repeated saturation. I mentioned this to Walter, who added it to our growing file, though we both agreed we had no standing yet to force an inspection without more concrete proof of danger. 2 weeks into the audit, the independent auditor requested an in-person meeting with the full board, a request Deborah tried unsuccessfully to postpone twice, citing scheduling conflicts that grew increasingly implausible. When the meeting finally happened, Walter texted me a single line afterward: "It's worse than we thought. Way worse." On the phone that night, Walter explained that the auditor had found not just the $48,000 payment to Deborah's husband's company, but 2 additional undisclosed payments totaling nearly $30,000 more, spread across 18 months. One payment had gone to a consulting fee for Corey personally, despite him holding no professional license of any kind, a fact the auditor flagged immediately as a serious red flag requiring further investigation. The auditor also discovered that the original county permit Deborah had shown the board, the one dated 8 months prior, had been altered. This project description changed after the fact using a font that didn't match the rest of the document. Someone, the auditor's report noted carefully, had taken an approved permit for a minor berm and edited the digital PDF to make it appear to cover full creek diversion, a modification that, if traced to Deborah, would constitute document fraud. Walter said the auditor recommended referring the entire matter to both county code enforcement and the state HOA regulatory board, given the scope of financial and permitting irregularities uncovered in just 3 weeks of review. For the first time since this began, I let myself believe Deborah Whitfield might actually face real consequences, though a part of me knew she wouldn't accept that outcome quietly. Deborah's response to the leaked audit findings, once whispers began spreading through the neighborhood group chat, was not panic or apology. It was fury, cold and calculated, aimed squarely at the people she blamed for exposing her. She called Frank personally, threatening to report his crawlspace flooding claim as insurance fraud, insisting he'd damaged his own foundation and was using her project as a convenient excuse to file a false claim. Frank, 81 years old and shaking with anger for the first time in the whole ordeal, told her exactly where she could put her threat before hanging up on her mid-sentence. She turned next to Priya, filing an anonymous complaint with the County Animal Control Office claiming Priya's rescue dog was aggressive, a claim that triggered a mandatory inspection visit and weeks of stress before being dismissed as baseless. With Walter, she moved through the board itself, calling a special vote to remove him from his position entirely, citing conduct unbecoming a board member for sharing audit information with residents, technically against strict bylaw interpretation. The vote failed, 4-3, but only barely, and only because 2 board members who'd previously sided with Deborah quietly abstained, having apparently seen enough of the financial records themselves to lose their nerve. Toward me, she escalated furthest of all. A county code enforcement officer showed up at my door one afternoon, responding to an anonymous tip that I was running an unlicensed home business, which I was not. The officer, professional and unbothered, found nothing, apologized for the inconvenience, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that this was the 3rd baseless tip he'd received about Willow Creek Estates addresses in 2 weeks. That detail confirmed what we already suspected. Deborah wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was actively weaponizing every institutional channel she could reach against anyone connected to exposing her. Patricia, our lawyer, said this shift mattered legally. A pattern of retaliatory reports following a whistleblower complaint could itself become grounds for a harassment claim, strengthening rather than weakening our position. Still, living inside that pattern felt nothing like legal strategy. Felt like being watched. Like every ordinary interaction with a neighbor might be another quiet report filed somewhere against my family. Lily started asking why Mommy looked at her phone so much, why I kept glancing out the window at night. I hated that this woman's greed had reached even into my daughter's sense of safety at home. Daniel, usually calm, told me one night that if things escalated further, he wanted to talk seriously about moving, about whether staying and fighting was worth what it was costing our family's peace. I understood his fear completely, but I thought of Frank's ruined photographs, of the Hendersons who'd been driven out years before any of us arrived, and I couldn't make myself agree to simply leave too. If we leave, I told him, she wins again, and she'll do this to whoever moves in next. I want to see this through. Daniel took my hand across the table and nodded, slowly, and said, "Then we see it through together. But we do it smart, not angry. Angry is what she wants from us." We shifted strategy after that, moving quieter, more deliberate. Patricia advised routing all further complaints through her office rather than directly, removing Deborah's ability to trace retaliation back to any single household. Walter, still on the board despite the failed removal vote, began requesting formal written responses to every board decision, creating a paper trail that would be difficult for Deborah to later claim didn't exist. Meanwhile, the County Code Enforcement Office, having now received Frank's, Priya's, and our formal drainage complaint alongside the auditor's fraud referral, finally scheduled a full site inspection of the pond and diversion channel for the following week. Deborah, aware the inspection was coming, spent the days beforehand frantically directing Corey and a hired crew to reinforce the visible portions of the spillway, pouring fresh concrete over the hairline crack I'd noticed weeks earlier. What she didn't fix, because she couldn't see it, was the compacted soil failure beneath the surface. The very foundation issue my father had warned could weaken with repeated saturation over time. The inspector arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, measuring, photographing, and asking pointed questions Corey struggled to answer about load calculations, spillway capacity, and the original creek's natural floodplain boundaries. Deborah stayed close by throughout, charming and attentive, offering the inspector lemonade and mentioning, more than once, how much the beautification project had already raised neighborhood property values. The inspector, unmoved by lemonade, later confirmed to Walter privately that the structure appeared to violate at least 3 county floodplain modification codes and recommended an immediate hold on any further construction pending formal review. That hold order arrived by certified mail 3 days later, along with notice of a mandatory hearing before the County Planning Commission, scheduled for early August, just 5 weeks away. For the first time, Deborah's confident public mask slipped visibly. At the next HOA meeting, her hands trembled slightly as she read a prepared statement calling the hold order a bureaucratic misunderstanding she intended to resolve quickly. Behind the scenes, according to Walter's careful notes, Deborah began making frantic calls to a name none of us recognized at first. A county permitting clerk named Gregory Okafor, whom she'd apparently known personally for years. It emerged, slowly, through records Patricia subpoenaed as part of our now-forming legal complaint, that Gregory had personally approved the original minor berm permit years earlier, and had done so with unusual speed for that season. Financial records Patricia obtained showed 2 payments from an account linked to Deborah's husband to a landscaping business owned by Gregory's brother-in-law. Payments timed suspiciously close to permit approval dates on 2 separate projects, including ours. It wasn't proof of a bribe outright, Patricia cautioned, but it was more than enough to warrant referring Gregory's conduct to the County Inspector General's office alongside our existing complaints against Deborah. When this news reached the neighborhood, even some of Deborah's staunchest longtime supporters began to quietly distance themselves, unwilling to be associated publicly with what was starting to look like an actual corruption investigation. Deborah, sensing her support eroding, pivoted tactics entirely. She began telling neighbors privately that Mara-chan and her little group were trying to destroy Willow Creek's reputation and tank everyone's home values out of pure spite. A few people believed her. Most, by now, had seen too much. Frank's ruined photographs, the fines, the animal control complaint against Priya's dog, the audit findings to fall for the story a second time. With the county hearing approaching and public opinion shifting, Deborah made her most reckless decision yet, one that would ultimately define how this entire story ended for everyone involved. She decided, against Corey's frightened objections and without any permit at all, to have the crew work through the following weekend to widen the spillway further, hoping to relieve pressure before the hearing without official approval. It was, essentially, an attempt to fix an illegal structure with more illegal construction, rushed, unsupervised, and driven purely by panic rather than any real engineering judgment. Walter learned about the unauthorized weekend work through a resident who lived directly across from Deborah's property and had noticed the crew's trucks returning despite the county's explicit hold order still being in effect. We photographed the trucks arriving Saturday morning, time-stamped and geotagged, and Patricia filed an emergency motion with the county citing a direct violation of the existing hold order, requesting immediate enforcement action. A county enforcement officer arrived Saturday afternoon and issued Deborah a formal stop work order on the spot, along with a citation carrying a fine far larger than any she'd ever issued to a single one of us. Deborah, humiliated in front of her own crew and several onlooking neighbors, reportedly screamed at the officer that he had no idea who he was dealing with, a scene 3 separate witnesses later described almost identically. That evening, Corey quit. He texted Walter, of all people, saying he'd never wanted to be part of whatever this had become, and that he'd cooperate fully with any investigation if it meant clearing his own name. Corey's cooperation proved significant. He admitted, in a recorded statement to county investigators, that Deborah had instructed him to alter the original permit document himself, dictating the exact wording change over speakerphone 11 months earlier. He also admitted he had no engineering training beyond a single online landscaping course, and that Deborah had repeatedly told him not to worry about load calculations because contractors overthink these things anyway. With Corey's statement added to the file, what had started as a neighborhood drainage dispute now stood as a documented case of permit fraud, financial misappropriation, and potential bribery, all traceable directly back to Deborah Whitfield. The county hearing was still weeks away, but the weight of what we'd uncovered sat heavy over the whole street. Even Deborah's driveway, usually busy with visitors, sat quiet and empty most days now. I found myself, oddly, not triumphant but tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from months of watching your neighbor's homes flood while a woman in a sun hat called it beautification. Frank's crawlspace had dried out. Mostly, though he mentioned a musty smell that never fully left. A small permanent reminder of what those photographs had cost him before he even knew who'd caused it. Priya's koi pond remained dry. The natural spring feeding it still redirected somewhere into Deborah's now-condemned channel. A small daily loss that no lawsuit could quite restore to what it had been. Rosalind's fence had been temporarily repaired, though the county inspector noted the underlying soil along that stretch remained compromised, and recommended full geological assessment before any permanent fix was attempted. Walter, worn from months of quiet resistance, told me over coffee that he intended to run for HOA president himself once this was resolved, saying the community deserved a board that read the bylaws instead of weaponizing them. Daniel and I began, cautiously, letting Lily play in the backyard again, though I still found myself glancing at the creek line more than I used to, watching the water's color and speed like a habit I couldn't break. The Weather Service, meanwhile, had begun issuing early warnings about an unusually active storm system forming off the coast, projected to bring the heaviest regional rainfall in nearly a decade sometime in the coming weeks. My father, hearing this on the phone, went quiet for a moment before saying carefully, "Mara, if that channel's foundation is really compromised the way you described, a storm like that could be very, very bad." I brought his concern to Walter and Patricia both. Patricia agreed to file an emergency request asking the county to mandate immediate structural reinforcement or full channel decommissioning before the storm system arrived. Given the existing hold order, the request moved slower than any of us wanted. County offices, we learned, did not operate on the same urgent timeline as an approaching storm, no matter how many documented red flags already sat in Deborah's file. Deborah, for her part, continued to insist publicly that the pond and channel were perfectly safe, telling a local community Facebook group that fear-mongering neighbors were exaggerating a completely stable structure for their own vendetta. 10 days before the storm's projected arrival, the county granted a partial order requiring Deborah to install temporary sandbag reinforcement along the spillway's weakest points, a stopgap measure far short of what real structural repair would require. Deborah hired a new crew, cheaper and faster than the last, to install the sandbags, boasting in her newsletter that Willow Creek was storm-ready and more beautiful than ever thanks to her proactive leadership. Walter, reviewing the crew's paperwork out of habit, discovered they held only a general landscaping license, not the specialized flood control certification the county order had technically specified, though no one caught the discrepancy in time to stop the work. I mentioned this to Patricia, who said the discrepancy, while troubling, likely wouldn't halt anything before the storm arrived, and that our best move now was documentation, not another delay-inducing legal filing. So we documented. Unevenly stacked and already shifting within days of installation. Photos of new water seeping through gaps along the channel's base that hadn't been visible before. Frank, watching the sandbag crew from his porch one afternoon, remarked to me that they reminded him of soldiers building a defense line without knowing which direction the enemy was actually coming from. It was, in hindsight, an eerily accurate description. The sandbags addressed surface erosion, a problem visible to the eye, while the real danger sat invisible beneath the soil, exactly where Corey's rushed original work had never been properly compacted. 5 days before the storm, the National Weather Service upgraded its warning, now projecting the heaviest single rainfall event the region had seen in over 20 years, with flash flooding likely in low-lying and creek-adjacent areas. Deborah scheduled an emergency HOA meeting, not about evacuation planning or drainage safety, but about finalizing plans for her upcoming autumn gazebo installation, apparently unwilling to let the storm interrupt her renovation calendar. Walter, incredulous, asked her directly whether the board shouldn't instead discuss emergency preparedness given the compromised channel behind her own property. Deborah waved the question away, saying the sandbags had it handled. 3 days before the storm, I drove Lily to stay with my parents 2 hours inland, unwilling to gamble her safety on sandbags installed by a landscaping crew with the wrong certification. Daniel stayed behind with me. We moved our most irreplaceable belongings, photographs, documents, Lily's baby book to the second floor, a precaution that felt both reasonable and faintly ridiculous as we did it. Frank refused to evacuate, insisting he'd weathered worse storms in the military than some overhyped weather report, though he did agree, at my urging, to move his remaining photograph boxes to his attic. Priya's family left for her sister's house across town, taking their dog and leaving Priya's husband behind briefly to secure their windows and move patio furniture out of the yard. Rosalind, whose compromised fence line worried me most, agreed to stay with her sister-in-law across the street for the duration of the storm, a small relief among the mounting anxiety on our block. Deborah, according to a neighbor who saw her that final evening, was overheard on her patio phone loudly instructing someone to make sure the insurance paperwork is current, a detail that would later matter more than anyone realized at the time. That detail, small and overheard almost by accident, would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of the entire story, though none of us understood its weight until much later. The storm arrived a day early, faster and harder than even the upgraded forecast had predicted. Rain falling in sheets so thick the streetlights barely cut through it by 9 that first night. By midnight, Frank called to say water was already at his crawlspace door again, higher and faster than any previous flood, and that he could hear something like rushing rapids from somewhere up the hill. Daniel and I stood at our back window with flashlights, watching the creek, no longer a creek at all, but a churning brown torrent, surge against the edges of Deborah's overwhelmed concrete channel. At 1:47 in the morning, according to the official county incident report filed weeks later, the compromised soil beneath Deborah's spillway finally gave way under the combined weight of floodwater and inadequately compacted fill. The concrete channel didn't just overflow, it fractured, a jagged crack splitting the structure roughly down its center. And in an instant the entire redirected creek found a new, catastrophic path of least resistance. That path led directly downhill, straight through Deborah's own backyard first, before the diverted flood surge fanned out toward the 6 lower properties, including Frank's, Priya's, Rosalind's, and our own. Frank's crawlspace, which had flooded 3 separate times already, filled completely within 20 minutes. Water climbing his interior stairs before he managed to retreat safely to his second floor with his rescued photograph boxes. Our own backyard fence, weakened months earlier by the very first diversion work, buckled and washed away entirely, muddy water surging across our lawn and lapping at the base of our back door. Daniel and I spent that night on our second floor, listening to the terrifying rush of water below, texting Frank and Priya's husband updates every few minutes as the storm raged on outside. But the worst damage, as it turned out, wasn't happening in any of our homes. It was happening at the very top of the hill, at the source of everything, at Deborah Whitfield's own villa, the fractured spillway, unable to hold back the surge any longer, sent the full uncontrolled force of the swollen creek directly against the unreinforced foundation of Deborah's pondside sunroom addition, built just 18 months earlier. The sunroom's foundation, poured on the same rushed, uncompacted soil as the channel itself, gave way first, water pouring through the collapsing structure and into the villa's lower level within minutes. By dawn, when the rain finally began to ease, Deborah's basement, the one she'd renovated into a wine cellar and home theater, proudly featured in the community newsletter twice, sat under nearly 6 feet of muddy floodwater. The morning after the storm revealed a neighborhood transformed. Our own yard was a wreck of mud and displaced fencing, but our house, raised slightly above the immediate flood line, had stayed dry inside. Frank's crawlspace was ruined beyond simple cleanup this time, water reaching nearly to his first floor, though he himself, along with his rescued photographs, remained safe upstairs throughout the night. Priya's backyard had lost most of its landscaping to the surge. Her koi pond's dry basin now, ironically, the only part of her property that had actually held water correctly during the flood. Rosalind's already compromised fence line had collapsed entirely, though her house itself, further from the channel's direct path, escaped the worst of the structural damage that hit properties closer to the source. But nothing compared to what greeted the first emergency responders who reached the top of the hill. Deborah Whitfield's villa, half submerged, its grand white columns now streaked brown with mud and debris. The sunroom addition had partially collapsed into what used to be her prized reflection pond, now an indistinguishable churn of broken concrete, uprooted landscaping, and floating patio furniture from her own garden parties. Her wine cellar and home theater, the pride of 2 separate newsletter features, sat completely submerged, thousands of dollars in ruined electronics and imported wine bottles floating uselessly in the flooded darkness below. Deborah and her husband had evacuated safely before the worst hit, alerted by the same crack of collapsing concrete that had jolted half the hillside awake. But they returned that morning to find their legacy property gutted. News crews, drawn by the scale of destruction along an entire residential hillside, arrived by mid-morning, and the story of Willow Creek's flood spread quickly beyond our small community into regional coverage. A local reporter, working a separate tip, had already obtained a copy of the county's stop work order and hold notice from weeks earlier, and the questions during the on-camera interviews turned pointed almost immediately. Standing in front of her ruined villa, mud-streaked and visibly shaken, Deborah told the reporter this was an unforeseeable natural disaster, insisting no one could have predicted rainfall of this magnitude hitting the area. The reporter, having done her homework, asked directly about the existing county hold order and stop work citation issued weeks before the storm. Deborah's composure cracked visibly on camera, live, for the entire viewing region to see. By that afternoon, the county planning office had confirmed publicly that Deborah's property had been under an active construction hold at the time of the flood, and that unauthorized weekend work had violated that order directly. Corey's earlier recorded statement to investigators, describing the falsified permit and rushed, uncertified construction, was referenced by name in the county's official press release later that same day, confirming what our folder had documented for months. Within 48 hours, insurance adjusters for Deborah's homeowner's policy arrived to assess the damage, and it was here that the earlier overheard phone call about insurance paperwork finally revealed its terrible significance. The adjusters discovered, cross-referencing county records now made public, that the sunroom addition and pond structure had never been properly permitted or disclosed to the insurance company at the time of policy renewal, a material omission, under the terms of most standard homeowners policies. Undisclosed, unpermitted structural additions that directly cause flood damage can void coverage for that portion of a claim entirely, and Deborah's insurer moved to deny the majority of her claim within the week. The financial blow was staggering. Structural engineers estimated the villa's damage at well over $400,000, nearly all of it now falling entirely on Deborah and her husband, with no insurance safety net to soften it. Meanwhile, the county's fraud investigation, already underway before the storm, accelerated dramatically once the flood made national adjacent regional news, drawing scrutiny neither Deborah nor Gregory Okafor, the permitting clerk, had anticipated. Investigators executing a records request on Gregory's office computer found the original, unaltered permit file still stored in the system backup, the minor berm description intact, directly contradicting the version Deborah had shown the HOA board. Metadata on that backup file showed the document had been accessed and modified from an IP address later traced to Deborah's home network, timestamped just 2 days before she'd presented it to the board as proof of approval. Gregory, facing his own mounting legal exposure, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, providing records of the 2 suspicious payments from Deborah's husband's account that had troubled Patricia weeks earlier. Those payments, Gregory admitted under questioning, had indeed been intended to ensure smooth processing of Deborah's various permit requests over the years, a euphemism investigators translated plainly in their report as bribery. With Gregory's cooperation, Corey's recorded statement, the falsified documents' metadata, and the auditor's earlier financial findings, the county formally filed multiple charges against Deborah Whitfield: document fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, and conspiracy to bribe a public official. The news moved through Willow Creek faster than the floodwater had. Neighbors who defended Deborah for years at potlucks and garden tours suddenly found themselves reading the same charges out loud in disbelief on the community app. The HOA board, shaken by the scale of what the county investigation had uncovered, convened an emergency session and voted unanimously, no abstentions this time, to formally remove Deborah Whitfield from her position as president, effective immediately. Walter, quiet and methodical as ever, was appointed interim president by the remaining board members, a choice that felt, to everyone who'd watched him work for months, entirely fitting given everything he'd uncovered. Deborah did not attend the meeting where her removal was voted on. Her attorney appeared briefly on a video call, reading a short statement that mentioned only differing visions for the community's future. In the weeks that followed, civil claims began arriving from every direction. Frank filed for the full cost of his repeatedly ruined crawlspace and irreplaceable photographs. Priya sought damages for her koi pond and the false animal control complaint. Rosalind's fence repair costs, combined with the geological assessment the county now required for her property, added another substantial claim to the growing pile building against Deborah and her husband's remaining assets. Daniel and I, working with Patricia, filed our own claim covering our fencing, landscaping, and the months of documented harassment and retaliatory fines, though for us the point had never really been about the money. Patricia estimated that between civil claims, county fines, and the criminal restitution likely to be ordered if convictions followed, Deborah and her husband faced potential liabilities well beyond what their remaining uninsured equity in the villa could cover. Facing that reality, and with criminal charges pending, Deborah's attorney began quiet discussions with several claimants about a settlement, one that would ultimately require selling the villa, her legacy property, just to begin covering the debt. The villa went on the market 3 months after the flood, still bearing visible water damage the sellers hadn't fully repaired. A stark contrast to the crown jewel of Willow Creek Deborah had once proudly called it. Sold, eventually, to a young couple who had no idea about any of the history, at a price nearly 40% below what comparable homes in the neighborhood, undamaged and untouched by scandal, were fetching. Deborah and her husband moved out quietly on a weekday afternoon. No farewell party, no glossy newsletter announcement, just a moving truck and a handful of boxes loaded under a gray autumn sky. I watched from my porch as the truck pulled away, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter and heavier. The particular exhaustion of finally exhaling after holding your breath for the better part of a year. Frank, standing beside me with his cane, said simply, "Good riddance," before turning back toward his own porch, his photograph boxes finally dry and safely stored in a proper archival container Daniel had helped him build. The criminal case moved slower than the civil settlements, as these things often do, but 8 months after the flood, Deborah pleaded guilty to reduced charges of document fraud and misappropriation of association funds. She avoided prison time, sentenced instead to 5 years probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board within the state. A small but pointed piece of justice. Gregory Okafor, the permitting clerk, lost his county job entirely and faced his own separate bribery charges, his cooperation earning him probation rather than jail time, though his professional reputation never recovered. Corey, whose youthful naivety had made him useful to Deborah rather than genuinely malicious, avoided charges altogether in exchange for his testimony, though he moved out of state not long after, unwilling to face the neighborhood's lingering resentment. Rebuilding Willow Creek's actual creek took the better part of a year, funded through a combination of county disaster relief grants and a special HOA assessment. The new board, under Walter's leadership, explained transparently at every step. A licensed hydrological engineering firm, the kind that should have been consulted from the very beginning, redesigned the waterway to restore its natural floodplain bend, widening the channel gently rather than forcing it through concrete. Frank's crawlspace was finally, properly repaired, this time with a sump pump system and drainage grading done to actual code. A small technical detail that nonetheless felt like the end of a very long chapter for him. Priya's koi pond was restored too, fed once again by the natural spring the diversion had cut off. Her fish, rehomed with a neighbor during the dry months, finally returned to swim in familiar water. Rosalind's fence and the underlying soil along her property line were fully stabilized, the geological assessment confirming, at last, that the ground beneath her yard was sound for the first time in over a year. Walter, Elected formally as HOA president that spring with the widest margin in the community's recorded history, instituted a new bylaw requiring independent professional review for any project altering natural waterways or exceeding a modest cost threshold. He also began publishing full, itemized financial reports quarterly, a habit so different from the opacity of Deborah's years that several longtime residents told him, half joking, it was almost disorienting to actually understand where their dues went. My father visited that autumn, walking the newly restored creek bank with Lily, now 3, pointing out how the water moved gently around its natural curves instead of blasting through a narrow concrete channel. This is how it's supposed to work, he told her, crouching beside the bank. Water finds its own way, if you let it. Fighting it just means it comes back harder. Eventually, Lily nodded solemnly, not understanding, but listening. I thought about that a lot in the months after, how Deborah had spent years trying to force the neighborhood, and the land itself, into the shape she wanted, punishing anyone or anything that resisted, and how, in the end, it wasn't the neighbors she'd fined or intimidated who brought her down. It was the water itself, following the only law it ever really answered to, finding its way back to where it belonged. Frank passed away peacefully the following spring, and at his small memorial, Priya read aloud a short passage he'd written for the community newsletter years earlier, about what it meant to actually know your neighbors. We scattered a few of his ashes, at his family's request, along the restored creek bank near his old property. The water he'd fought so hard to keep out of his home finally running clear and calm beside him. Priya's koi pond thrived that year, full of new fry born to fish that had survived a flood, a drought, and a false accusation, outlasting every single obstacle Deborah Whitfield had ever put in their path. Rosalind started a small community garden along the creek's restored floodplain, open to any resident who wanted a plot, the kind of shared, transparent project Willow Creek had never quite managed under its old leadership. Walter, still meticulous, still quiet, still taking notes on his yellow legal pad, told me once that he never expected to become the neighborhood's accidental historian, but that someone had needed to, eventually, and it might as well have been him, Deborah. According to Patricia, who kept loose track of the case's aftermath for professional reasons, moved to a small rental property 2 counties away, far from any HOA board she might have hoped to charm her way onto again. Her husband, facing his own separate financial fallout from the LLC's dissolution and the settlement payments, filed for divorce 11 months after they left the villa. A final, quiet epilogue neither of them had likely imagined for themselves. I don't know exactly what Deborah's life looks like now, and honestly, I stopped wondering much after the first year. Some chapters close on their own once you stop turning back to reread them. What I do know is that our creek runs clear again, that Lily plays barefoot along its bank every summer evening, and that no one in Willow Creek Estates has to fear an envelope stamped urgent taped to their door. Sometimes, watching the water move past our fence line exactly the way it's supposed to, I think about how close we came to losing all of it, simply because one woman wanted a prettier view from her sunroom. The folder I kept that whole difficult year still sits in my desk drawer, unopened most days now, a quiet reminder that patience, documentation, and a few brave neighbors can outlast even the loudest, most entitled kind of power. Willow Creek flows on, gentle and unbothered, exactly as it always should have, and somewhere far from here, a woman who once tried to own a river is learning, slowly, that some things were never hers to redirect. The END.